Hi everybody, I'm Amy Rafferty, as I just said. I'm a member of the CYM and the CPI, and I'll be chairing the lecture for you today. So, welcome to the 2020 Madge Davison Memorial Lecture, an annual feature of the Féile in Phobail, West Belfast Festival. This marks the 10th year that a memorial has been organised in memory of Madge, a woman who devoted much of her life to justice and making the world a better place. Madge was born on the Shore Road in a loyalist area of North Belfast. At 16, she turned to the Communist Party, making the decision to join the Communist Youth League, later to be known as the All-Ireland Colony Youth Movement, of which she was the first General Secretary. Like many of us, her decision to become involved in the CPI was one that shaped her understanding of the world and of politics. Madge was massively involved in the civil rights movement, leading her to become assistant organiser and then organiser of the United Civil Rights Association, to which she was devoted. Madge is described by her comrades as an outstanding communist, orator and an excellent organiser. At the young age of 41, Madge passed away, leaving behind two dearly loved sons and her comrade husband, John Hall. Madge Davison continues to serve as a great inspiration and example for young communists all over Ireland. To find out more about Madge, there's a book available. It's the Madge Davison Revolutionary Firebrand. If you're interested in purchasing a copy, you can email unitycpiireland@gmail.com, and it's £6.50 in food packaging. The topic of today's talk is very relevant to the civil rights movement. At the time, in order to vote in local elections, you had to be a ratepayer and therefore own a house, a luxury that a huge portion of the working class didn't have, disproportionately Catholic. Therefore, allocation of housing was incredibly important, and so the responsibility was taken away from the local authorities and given to the housing executive. And with that, I'd like to welcome Professor Stewart Smyth, a researcher, trade unionist and activist. He's carried out research in the housing issues for NIPSA. He's here to talk to us about the past, present and future of the housing executive. Here to talk, he'll draw on the history of the housing executive, its formation through the civil rights struggle, and how it became recognised as an international leader in public housing before falling victim to privatisation thefts and political indifference. He'll argue that a revitalised and fully funding housing executive is essential to provide decent, secure housing and to generate jobs, economic activity.
That's great. Thanks very much, Amy, for the introduction, and thanks very much to the organisers, and in particular Linda, for inviting me to this obviously prestigious event. And I hope that during the course of the presentation and the discussion that we have, that I do honour Madge Davison's legacy. I think she would be approving of the topic from what I've read about her. So let's get stuck into the presentation. I'm going to share my screen now and go through a series of slides. You get to see down the right-hand side of your screen, there are some boxes will come up with the heads in them. You can actually reduce them down to just being one person in case it takes over too much of the screen. So if you want to play around with that as an alternative, there we go. Grand. So, as Amy outlined, I'm going to talk about the housing executive, the past, present, and the future of it. Necessarily, when we're talking about something that has its roots actually 100 years ago, because we need to start really with the foundation of the Orange State and the role that public housing, played in that. So necessarily, it's going to be somewhat of a kind of a skim across the top. But maybe if there are particular issues that people want to talk about as we get into the discussion, then that'd be great. So just as a brief introduction, what we'll be looking at, I'll do a short personal introduction on the next slide. We'll go through and then look at the roots and the way that public housing was used in establishing Northern Ireland as a Protestant state, for Protestant people, as Craig Gavin used the term, and talk about how housing helped spark the civil rights movement, and what happened with the housing executive then, really over kind of three periods: its formation, and then moving from worst to best in terms of some of the housing stock in Western Europe. And then what's happened over the last kind of 20 years. I'm just picking out one example, but there's a whole range of policies that we can talk about in that, where there's been a combination actually of kind of political indifference on one side and an uncritical adoption of what comes out of Westminster, which is essentially forms of neoliberal attacks. And then finish off the presentation by saying this is all political. These are political choices that are being made by both the policymakers and our elected representatives. But the future's not yet written, and recent housing campaigns show that there is an alternative for us, and that we don't have to go down the same route that has happened to public housing elsewhere in these islands, where it has been residualised and tenants have been demonised, etc. So we can actually have a good system of public housing if the political will is there, and it's beneficial then, as I've always argued, that if we have strong public housing, that is beneficial for the whole of society, not just the people who actually live in that housing. So my kind of background on this, I suppose I've been studying housing and public housing again kind of in these islands. A lot of my earlier work when I was doing the PhD was around local government housing in England, Scotland and Wales. And I'd always been aware of the possibilities, although Northern Ireland hadn't had the same kind of policy implemented of transferring public housing, council housing to housing associations, effectively moving them from the public sector into the private sector. That policy hadn't taken up so much in Northern Ireland, and it wasn't until 2013 that, as we'll see later on, Nelson McCausland, who was a minister at the time in charge of the housing executive, decided that that was the policy that he wanted to follow. And it was from there that we got in touch with, NIPSA got in touch with me, and Paddy was involved in a couple of others as well. And since then, we've done 3 research reports on what we can do in terms of not just stopping the housing executive actually being privatised, but also looking at what are the benefits of having a fully funded housing executive. And so those are the kind of the three reports from 2013, 2017 and 2020. They're all available on the NIPSA website if we wanted to follow them through. So if we start off and looking at saying, well, to understand the housing executive and the emergence of the housing executive out of the civil rights movement, we have to understand the nature of housing and public housing in the context of the Northern Ireland state, the Orange state. And of course, it's a process about how partition actually came about, something, of course, that we're going to be looking at during this kind of decade of centenaries, that we're going to be looking at a lot next year and the year after. I suppose the important data that I've picked out in relation to housing is that on the 21st of December 1921, the local responsibility for local government transferred from Dublin to Belfast in the 6 counties. And that was a starting point in terms of then, as Michael Farrell talks about, unionists set about constructing an Orange and Protestant state through an elaborate and comprehensive system of discrimination in housing and jobs. And there were other people actually on the call who know far more about this than I do. I actually lived through a lot of this. So I don't intend to go through the kind of the detail of it. But again, if we want to talk about the detail in relation to the gerrymandering of local elections, the point about the restricted franchise has already been made, about you had to be a ratepayer to be able to vote in local elections. And then, of course, there was the construction of the Boundary Commission and the construction of the massively unequal constituencies and employment discrimination practices that went on right across the public sector and the private sector during the early to middle part of the last century. And of course, housing plays an important part in that, particularly in relation to the gerrymandering element, because the last thing you want to be doing if you're a unionist, loyalist councillor in charge of a local authority is building new housing when you know that there is greater housing deprivation in the nationalist Catholic community, and building that new housing in areas where you've got slim majorities, manageable but slim majorities, returning unionist Protestant politicians. You don't want to upset that balance. So the housing allocations and the housing policies in relation to where the new builds were to happen is a crucial part in understanding actually how the gerrymandering of the local elections went on. And so here's a couple of examples. The first one just about the way that in Derry, for example, huge pressures on the bog side in terms of housing and a housing need occurring. The areas to develop were on the water side or other areas where Protestant unionist politicians would seek to get elected. And so one way of doing this was instead of building any housing because you were worried about, or the unionists were worried about actually unsettling the majorities that they had built in to the Boundary Commission. One of the ways of dealing with that was just not to build any housing. And so we have the example here that O'Doherty brings out from 1967, 1,400 families on the city's waiting list, no housing being built by the city at that point. And the same thing happened, that's only one example, actually relatively small example, with some of the local authorities in Fearrmanagh throughout most of the middle part of the last century actually didn't build any housing for this very reason, that if they built the housing, they would have to actually put nationalists and Catholics into those houses, and that would upset the balance in terms of the gerrymandered majorities that they had. So that was one side of it. Another side of it, though, is, this is blatant quote that Mulholland picks out from George Elias, 1964, unionist chairman of the Enniskillen Housing Committee. It's only common sense, after all, that a unionist council is not going to put people into houses who are going to vote against them at the next election. Okay, so it's both sides. It's both actually impacts on where the houses are built and whether or not any houses should be built, and also then when the existing stock becomes available, who gets allocated that existing housing stock. One thing to note on this, and this reminded me, I was talking about this in a research seminar actually at Birmingham a couple of months ago, and it struck me discovering that quote and putting it together in this context, that actually the George Eliot quote is not unique. That mindset is not unique to Northern Ireland. The unionist element obviously is, but not in terms of the politician side of things. And of course, some of you may remember when we get to Dame Shirley Porter in Westminster and what the Conservatives did there, which were votes for homes as well, to again gerrymander and build in the majorities to ensure that the Conservatives kept control of Westminster Council. And so this kind of policy does happen in other places. What's different, though, is you go back, I think, to the Farrell quote earlier, that it was systematic, widespread, on the basis of across the 6 counties, right, building in this kind of discrimination. The other thing that's important, I think, to note on this before we start to look at what some of the reactions were is, some of you may know some of the history of kind of council housing and public housing, particularly in Britain, and to a lesser degree, I live in the south. I live in Dublin, which is where I'm speaking to you from today. There were periods during the last century where there were huge public house building programs, particularly over the water after each of the world wars, seen as being a way of, give the people social reform or they'll give you social revolution. There's a quote from after the First World War where one of the permanent secretaries in the Cabinet Office is quoted as saying, we're going to spend this money on building public housing as an insurance policy against the spread of Bolshevism. So there was very clear kind of response there to that dynamic of pressure from below, which we'll talk again about a little bit later. But those things happened in England, Scotland, and Wales in a slightly different form and slightly different timings. They happened in the South, in the Republic. They didn't happen in Northern Ireland. And so when we get through to the 1960s, there has been some expansion of public housing. Obviously, there was the Northern Ireland Housing Trust as well, but nowhere near on the same sort of scale. And so still significant numbers, and actually the majority of working class people in Northern Ireland in the 50s and 60s lived in private rented accommodation. Right, which means you had your private landlords who were like, elements of them certainly were like the Rachmanite kind of ones that we saw over in London and West London, who were just basically there trying to extract as much rent as possible from their properties. So that's the kind of context. And of course, because it's a private rented sector, no regulations, appalling conditions that people were living in. So those are the conditions and the context that housing becomes an issue for in the spark for the civil rights movement. And so housing predates, the campaigns around housing start to predate the formation of the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association. The Derry Housing Action Committee was formed the year before, or actually may even been 2 years before. I think it might have been 66 when it was formed. And you get a flavour here from Eamon McCann's book, War in Irishtown, about what they were doing through the Derry Housing Action Committee, right, where they began squatting in empty housing. They would physically resist any attempts to evict families. Right? Private landlords who were charging exorbitant rents were picketed. Right? The Northern Ireland Housing Trust, which becomes one of the component parts of the housing executive, as we'll see a little bit later, they were subject to a barrage of phone calls, personal visits, etc. Right? So there was this campaigning had started in the year or 2 years before the Civil Rights Association was formed, and was one of the component parts of the civil rights movement. And again, it feeds into this theme that I suppose runs through what I'm talking about today, and particularly pointing towards the direction of what are the alternatives, is that it comes from below, it comes from organising, it comes from campaigning. That's how we start to get real changes and real reforms. And of course, the Civil Rights Association, the first NICRA march, happens in the big one, of course, that we all remember is in October 68, because again the cameras were there. But in August 68 is the actual first one, and it comes because of an event in Caledon in Tyrone. Right? And it's a march from Caledon to Dungannon. And what was happening there, there's some confusion about the actual details. The key points of it, though, was I think is captured in this quote by Brett, who was one of the early. I think he was chairman of the chairperson of the Northern Ireland Housing Executive in the late 70s, early 80s, and he talks about how a young Catholic mother with a family had squatted in a house and was forcibly evicted. And then the television cameras showed horrified viewers, the bailiffs breaking down the front door, the family being dragged out, Mrs. Gildernew clutching her infant child, and her mother receiving cuts from the broken glass. And in a way, actually, what's happening here, and again in a reflection, a parallel, I suppose, with the US civil rights movements, is that this was very strongly something that Martin Luther King recognized, was that non-violence works when the cameras are there because it shows the violence coming from the oppressor. And so you get that same kind of dynamic starting here. And so that happens in June 1968, and that gives rise to the first march then in August 68. Of course, we know then the history that unfolds from there, from Derry in 68 being attacked and the riots happening, right, free Derry, and through the summer of '69, the rioting across Northern Ireland, the troops being deployed in August '69. And when you come to look at this in relation to housing and the link between the civil rights movement and the housing executive, very quickly in 1969, so we're still in '69, we still got a Labour government at that point. Heath doesn't take over until 1970, and they commissioned the Cameron report that is published later on in '69 after the riots during the summer and the troops being sent in August. And go through a whole range of things about what actually, of course, typical in terms of British mainstream politics, actually have no idea. They don't understand what's going on in Northern Ireland. They have no idea, they have no concept about what has actually occurred, about the way that the Northern Ireland state had built up to be, as we said, an Orange state, a Protestant state, etc. But they very quickly recognise actually the role that housing has played in that. And we've got the quote here from the Cameron report. This is the official British government report about the riots and the causes of the riots. And they say that it's the misuse in certain cases of discretionary power of allocation of houses in order to perpetuate unionist control of the local authority. And a range of other things as well, unfair methods of allocation of housing, inadequate housing provision by local authorities, all those things we talked about earlier, which all have their roots in trying to maintain the unionist gerrymandered majority. So that it's in those circumstances that an idea that had been lying around for a while, if you like, which is a phrase that's come back into use since COVID and the pandemic, had been Northern Ireland's Labour Party policy, my understanding, is to have a points-based system and an organisation that runs that points-based system overall. And so that's where the housing executive as an idea maybe comes forward. And it's followed through from the Cameron report through the legislation is passed in Stormont, that's still standing at that point. And the legislation then is passed and established the housing executive on the 25th of February 71. And over the next couple of years, the 150,000 homes are transferred from local authorities, from the Northern Ireland Housing Trust, and from some district council or district development commissions, all transferred over to the housing executive. And what you start to see there straight away is that one of the first things that the housing executive did was what's known as a stock condition survey, 1974, to look at all the homes that currently have and see what the condition they're in, because that gives you some indication then of the maintenance or repair programs that are going to be needed. And in 1974, the 1 in 5, 20% of the homes that were in the public sector were in poor condition or unfit for occupation. A couple of other things before we come back to that side in terms of stock condition. A couple of other things that occurred during the 1970s. An allocation scheme or points-based scheme is launched in 1974, which has been tweaked, but is basically still in place now. A bit of a technical one. The next point: the new builds that the housing executive built throughout the 1970s, 1980s used what's known as the Parker Morris standards. So these are the building standards about how housing should be designed. And they were at the time the top end standards to be achieved in public housing. They were the standards that were introduced earlier in the century, after the Second World War. After the First World War, and had informed the building of those big public house building programs after the First and the Second World War. But the British government had moved away from those in the 1950s when the Conservatives took power, and actually downgraded and started to use poorer quality standards. In Northern Ireland, they stuck to the Parker Morris standards for the new builds for the housing executive, and it's one of the reasons why the housing executive homes were both desirable and continued to be so, because of the standards that were used in building in the first place. Also interesting and significant, and still on the books today, is the tenant voluntary housing purchase scheme, or more commonly known as the right to buy scheme. And that was the right to buy was the policy that was introduced by Margaret Thatcher. It was introduced in Northern Ireland earlier, so it comes in Britain in the Housing Act in 1980, but is introduced in Northern Ireland in 1979. I mentioned earlier about the stock condition survey in 74. When we get through to the fourth one of those stock condition surveys by 1987, the ratio of poor or unfit for occupation housing had gone from 1 in 5 to 1 in 12, so it had gone from 20% to just over 8%. So there's a huge development of maintenance, repairs, bringing existing housing stock up to standards and building new housing stock at these higher Parker Morris standards. And in large part, what had happened during that time as well was that the politicians, and in particular, well, maybe not so much the politicians, the policymakers, I think would be more accurate, during that time, during the 70s and the 80s, were able to come to an agreement with Westminster and with the Thatcher government that they were, by and large, housing needed to be seen as a priority, and so it wasn't subject to the same kinds of reforms and the same kinds of cuts that had happened to local authority housing over in Britain. Now that kind of détente, if you like, couldn't last, and ultimately, as we'll see from the mid-1990s, things start to change, and those ideas that we've seen so much of, what we kind of broadly call neoliberal ideas, privatisation, free market fundamentalism, the ideas that private sector management is much better than public sector management, which is bureaucratic, etc. All those kinds of ideas couldn't be kept at bay indefinitely, and so one of them starts to happen in the mid-1990s, which we'll come back to. But even with that, by the time we get through to 2011, there was a series of reports done around this time, around the 2009, 2010, 2011, looking at the housing executive, looking at the future of housing in Northern Ireland. And PwC, those of you, PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers, sorry, I should have said earlier on, actually my background is an accountant. I trained as an accountant before escaping, and I'm now a recovering accountant, and have been for a good number of decades now. But so when I see the likes of PwC, who are one of the cheerleaders and main advocates and used by governments, actually of all shades in Britain, to justify privatisations, to justify free market fundamentalism, etc. When they come out in the report in 2011 and say that the housing executive is one of the success stories of Northern Ireland's recent history, rightly regarded nationally and internationally as a leading authority on best practice in both housing management and community building, you know that if an organisation like PwC is saying that, there is a absolute veracity to those kinds of claims. All right. So the housing executive, and there isn't, certainly in these islands, there is no other organisation that is anywhere near like the housing executive and what the housing executive has been able to achieve since the early 1970s. I did mention earlier that the housing policy couldn't be kept at that kind of détente period through the 80s, and that one of the things that has happened since the middle of the 1990s, it hasn't been necessarily dramatic. Part of the reason it's not been necessarily dramatic, I think, is because there's been a certain indifference towards housing and housing is, or maybe that indifference is motivated by just seeing that housing is a very complicated issue, which in one way, if you listen to certain people, and these are usually the people who are calling for things to be more like the private sector, they say, oh, things are very complicated, we can't do anything. It's usually politicians actually who say that, well, it's too complicated for us to try and actually solve the housing problem and so on. Right? So maybe that's part of where the indifferences come from. But what there has been generally is this kind of uncritical adoption of what's coming out of Westminster, right? And the English approach. And so Jenny Muir, who's was a colleague of mine when I was at Queen's, did some research into how housing policy is formed in Northern Ireland. And basically one of the quotes, she talked to practitioners, she talked to politicians, she talked to policymakers. And this is a quote from one of the practitioners, where they basically say the focus is on reducing expenditure and the English solution is touted as the way forward. No evidence, no analysis, just rhetoric. And you can see that actually, that's my experience of looking at the way that housing policy has been tried to be implemented over the last decade or so in Northern Ireland is just there's no evidence or analysis done to back any of these things up, and it's always done on the basis of Westminster basically tell us that this is what we have to do, and there is no other alternative. And so one of these policies that we can look at is goes back to this idea about the housing executive being banned from borrowing and from building new homes. And this fits within the broader neoliberal context. This is the idea that the state should get out of the way of the private sector, that the private sector and the market is the best, most efficient way that we can allocate resources. And so what we can do in the context of public housing is that we should get away from bureaucratic, inefficient housing organizations, comprehensive housing providers like the housing executive, and hand over responsibility and resources to private organizations such as housing associations. And if we stop the housing executive from building, then the housing associations will step in and will build will build more because they're more efficient. Okay, the reality is that kind of policy is just nonsense. It's not happened. We've got, those kinds of policies are great in textbooks and theories, but they don't work in practice, and we have the evidence now to show that. So if we look here, never mind, we could go back to 1975, 76, just as a starting point, and show that the housing executive then was building over 5,000 homes a year. And you just think about the difficulties at the time and the lack of money at the time, but yes, the housing executive was still able to build that amount at that point. But here, if we look into the middle of the 1990s, so we see here that the housing executive was able to build nearly 1,400 homes in the middle of the 1990s. And of course, the policy then kicks in. 10 years later, they're not building any. 20 years later, they're not building any. At that time, housing associations were building about 1,000. So you were getting social housing was 2,400. At no stage since 1996 has there been anywhere near 2,400 new social housing homes built in Northern Ireland. What we've had instead, as we know, is nothing from the housing executive, and the housing associations barely getting near what the housing executive were doing. Never mind this idea that actually they were going to do twice as many of their own, and there'd be this great expansion and it'd be lower costs, etc. So it's a policy failure. Stopping the housing executive from borrowing and from building new homes and putting all that money instead into housing associations has failed as a policy. And so that's part of what goes into, and there are other reasons, there are other, cuts and indifference and that have impacted on the housing executive, reforms that come out from the announcement made by Nelson McCausland in 2013, where he did try to put together, to give him his due, he tried to put together a comprehensive plan of dealing with the housing executive from his perspective, which of course was basically to privatise it. That's what they were trying to do in 2013. And what's happened, of course, because again, we have, Stormont doesn't sit, and so the minister is not there, decisions aren't made, consultations are done, but then they're left on the shelf, etc. And so 5 years later, we have this leaked letter that the detail got in November 2018, where there's basically, unless there is a new funding settlement for the housing executive, the threat is put forward that from this year onwards, approximately half of its portfolio is going to have to be divested. This is huge implications for this, and a huge challenge. And it's not just happened overnight. Like, this was known. I know when the new minister came in February, Deirdre Hargey, this was all over the news for a 24-hour cycle. It wasn't new then. It was known in 2018, and actually has been known for years beforehand. But the kind of the political indifference meant that nobody was willing to tackle the issue about funding. And this issue about funding is, as I've said, a political choice. It was a political choice back in the middle of the 1990s to stop the housing executive from borrowing and to stop the housing executive from building new homes, and to put that money into housing associations instead. We get the same here with Duncan Barry in his book from a few years ago, looking at radical solutions to the housing problems. His book is based mainly on England, and partly on Britain as well. But he brings out the points. It's a matter of political choice how governments spend their resources. Is it military capacity? Is it a housing programme? Right? And we can see that when we look here in the context of Northern Ireland as well. So it's approximately, this is from, these numbers may have changed a little bit, and of course the corporation tax number is the slippery fish. It depends on so many things, and it's been so politicised, it's very difficult to get to an actual number on it. But from a couple of years ago, we were able to say that there is the housing executive over the next 5 years needed 300 million a year in terms of investment to their maintenance programme, their repairs programme. That 300 million a year is roughly the same as how much corporation tax was going to be lost by reducing the corporation tax rate down to the same level as in the South, 12.5%. One of the things we were able to do in the report with NIPSA from 2013 was actually worked out that if that 300 million, instead of gambling on whether or not foreign direct investment would come, multinational corporations would invest in Northern Ireland, if it was instead ploughed straight into the housing executive and a new build housing programme, the 4,200 jobs would be directly created, never mind the indirect then creation that goes on from there. And that 300 million investment would generate, through the multiplier effect, 900 million in economic activity. And that was just one of the alternatives. There's the whole issue about what happens with housing benefit and the housing benefit element of universal credit being shifted out into the private rented sector, when that money instead could be used and ploughed into new build homes for the housing executive. These are all political choices. So the question then comes, how can we influence our politicians, our policymakers? And one of the great examples of this, and a successful example of this, has been the recent housing campaigns in the last few years, 2017, 2018. All right, so part of the announcement that Nelson McCausland made in 2013 to basically transfer the housing executive out of the public sector to well, he was vague about where they were going, but we assumed to a housing association, which is in the private sector. Part of what they did then of that was to say, well, we'll do some of these small-scale voluntary transfers. About 2,000 homes were going to be involved on a series of estates, and they were looking them as pilot schemes. All right. So the first two ballots happened in 2017 and 2018 on the Grange estate in Ballyclare and Phobail estate in Ballymena. And interestingly, in comparison, there were two earlier stock transfers in the Cregan and in Bangor, in Rinmore and in Bloomfield and Bangor. Those went through and the tenants voted for them. What's different with these two was there was a campaign here. It was led by NIPSA. There were housing activists involved as well. And went out onto those estates in Ballyclare and Ballymena, did all the stuff that you need to do to campaign from the grassroots, right? Delivering leaflets, talking to tenants, intervening in the public consultation meetings. And surprise, surprise, when you put forward the case about saying, actually, you don't have to go over to a housing association, you can stay with the housing executive, they still have a responsibility to improve the condition of your housing stock, or the homes that you live. Overwhelmingly, the tenants rejected the transfer to the housing associations. 90%, I think it was, in the Grange. And Paddy Mackle, who's quoted in one of the local newspapers, actually on the significance of this result, and he says it's a direct challenge to the government to halt the years of neglect of the housing executive. It's a call by citizens to properly fund the housing executive. And again, how can we influence policy? Well, because of these campaigns, not only did we stop the privatisation of those estates, but also as well in November of 2018, the department actually announced a suspension of the rest of that programme of small-scale voluntary transfers. Now it's a suspension, it's on the cards still. Maybe one of the things we can talk about in the discussion is about actually what's happening now and what are the prospects for the new minister and what she's likely to do for the housing executive. This could be revisited, but we know that there's a way to stop the privatisation of housing executive homes. So just to bring this all together as a conclusion, we need, and it's something that we've argued in the NIPSA reports, we need a Northern Ireland solution. We can see this starting to happen elsewhere, that actually housing policy in Scotland and in Wales is diverging away from Westminster. They're taking decisions to benefit the populations and working people in those countries. Right? We need the same kind of thing to happen in Northern Ireland, not just to follow the English housing policies. We know that our politicians are willing to do that. They've broken on other things: water rates, corporation tax, welfare reform mitigations, etc. So we need to find ways to put pressure on the politicians and the policymakers. And for me, the history that I've gone through there, the history of the housing activists leading to the civil rights movement, leading to the housing executive, which was a benefit for every working person across Northern Ireland. And the recent campaigns and struggles to keep housing within the housing executive, that's the way that we get meaningful reforms. You know, and I firmly believe, I've always believed, another housing policy is possible and another housing executive is possible. We don't have to witness the slow death of the housing executive, the concrete reform from the 68 generation and the civil rights movement. We don't have to witness that. We can actually do something about it and get a revitalised and rejuvenated housing executive that will be of a benefit for working people across Northern Ireland. So that's it. There's a bit of a bibliography with some references if anybody's interested, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much. So, folks, we're at 1:26 just because of the requirements of the Féile. We can only go as far as 1:40, so we should be about 14 minutes for Q&A. if people want to ask any questions. And Amy, I think one question was put in advance, wasn't it? By Pat Gregory, was it? Do you want to maybe start with that one?
Yeah, is it okay if I read it out, Pat? Yeah, isn't it? Yeah, all good. So first, can a change to the points system help ease the crisis? As the points vary from one part of Belfast, for example, in the White Rock area, 200 plus points are needed to get a chance of a house. And in the Shankill area, 150 will get you a chance of a house. Or two, allowing the NIHE to start building houses again.
I think you know where I'm going to come from on this, Pat, having seen the presentation. It's the second one is the key one, I think.
Just want to elaborate on that with a question. See, housing associations, their rent is extremely higher than housing executive rents are at present. So if you brought the housing executive or the housing association down level with the housing executive, would that then again also help deprivation within them areas? Because people are working part-time jobs and they have to pay the money they earn on rent towards housing associations, which are a business.
Yeah. So I think there are things to talk about in relation to the points and the point system. No point system is absolutely perfect. There is always going to be discriminations in one form or another within the point system. In comparison to where we were, if you go back to, you think about those examples that I talked about, the point system is a huge step forward for working people. And I would be very wary about getting rid of the point system or looking at the reforms. They've been on the cards for a number of years now that the department's been trying to look at this. But of course, they're looking at it as ways of trying to get rid of people off housing waiting lists.
Yeah.
Right. And similarly, the rent issue. You see, the way that I would do it is rather. I'm happy for housing associations to exist. I think they've got a role to play. I don't think they should be getting the same. They should be getting the amount of public funding that they are getting, and I certainly don't think that they should be getting that public funding instead of the housing executive, and the housing executive not being allowed to compete even on a level playing field for funding for new builds. But I think that both of those are relatively minor in terms of their impact as issue in relation to your second point here, which is the housing executive has to be allowed to build again, to borrow again. That's the key. That is the only, because we see this now across a whole range of areas, and actually the pandemic has illustrated it. Right? The tasks that we now face, the challenges we now face are so great in so many areas that tinkering around is not going to make a difference. Whether it's climate change or unemployment that we're facing now, or housing or health issues, and the only mechanism we have in society that's available to us is the state to be able to step in to do this. So we need a massive house building program coming out of the pandemic, and it should go through the housing executive. And one of the things that I mentioned this in a number of the reports, but one of the things that we picked out that was in the PwC report as well. And this is 10 years ago, but I think by and large it's still the same. The landlord function for the housing executive is financially sustainable. And public housing has always been financially sustainable because it's not a free house. It's an investment, and you pay a rent on it. The rent is different. The rent should be differentiated. It should be subsidised, right? But it's not free. You can make a return and a surplus on the landlord function if you do it properly. So I think that's the key. It has got to be the housing executive building new homes, putting people to work, new apprenticeships for young people as well, for the trades, all those it's there. We know it's there. It's a matter of political will.
Thank you. Thanks, Amy and Stuart. A good, interesting chat. Stuart, if you're based in Dublin, I imagine you're familiar enough with the situation down south as well as up north, especially in regards to the situation we have now, where even when the government promises X amount of homes, the financial ability to build those homes is crippled by private contractors and trying to meet the demands of the profit margins of a lot of contractors, essentially. Is that the same case with the executive? Do they have a different hiring scheme? Do they actually hire people to build houses and pay them like, on a PAYE kind of standard, or is it all still private contractors? Are they still dealing with that same circumstance as they do in the South?
So there's two solutions to the points that you raised, but of course the situation in the north is that the housing executive is not allowed to build new homes. So local authorities in the south do build some new homes. They don't build nearly enough of them, and they're often actually, as you point out, done through contracting. But the housing executive is not allowed to build them. I think there's 2 points that really, in terms of the policy for developing how we get over this. One is, in the short term, there are capacity issues because the housing executive is not built for so many years. The direct labour organisations that were available, those employees or those workers who were employed by the housing executive to build houses are now actually working in the private sector. So there will be some subcontracting or contracting out that needs to happen, at least initially. But there is no reason why those direct labour organisations, and the same as well with planners and architects, etc., can't be employed by the housing executive to build houses in the future. So that's one side. And that would be, I think, where we need to get to in terms of the policy. The other one is that is the big issue, I think, in the south as well, is public land for public housing. And the way that it is done, and it's happening in both sides of the border, is that governments are handing over public lands to the private developers on the basis that you might get a little bit of social housing, or certainly what happens is you get a promise at the beginning, and then they go and then the contracts are signed and they crunch the numbers. They say, "Oh, we can't do 15% anymore social housing. We'll have to do 10%. We'll have to do 5%." Or, well, actually, what we'll do is we will pay you money to the local authority. We'll pay you money instead of actually. So we'll buy ourselves out of that responsibility. So they get public lands that's either free or subsidised, and they don't build any public housing on it. So I think those are the two crucial things in terms of revitalising, crucial steps in terms of developing a policy to revitalise that demand for the housing executive to build a new generation of public housing.
Thank you. Linda, do you want to go ahead? Do you have your hand up quick?
Yes, I'd like to thank Stuart for doing the lecture, and the question of housing, it was, as he was saying, there was a major issue in the civil rights times, and it makes you wonder what he thinks about the indication of organisations like the SDLP and Sinn Féin, some of whom were involved in the struggle there. What indication is there that they would like that they will shift on this issue of public housing? And is there any idea that the local councils will ever play a role in these things? One time we had the direct building from local councils.
Thanks, Linda. It's interesting. The political thing's interesting because the SDLP did have the ministry. We're in charge of the ministry with Margaret Atwood. Margaret? No, I've got that wrong, haven't I?
Alex.
Ritchie.
Margaret's a writer.
Yeah, sorry. It's Margaret Ritchie. Wasn't she? And Alex Atwood. So Margaret Ritchie was the minister back in 2008, 2009, in charge of the departments, and it was at that time she started to push the stock transfers, the one in Rinmore and the one in Bloomfield. And the stock transfers are basically a form of privatisation, and you go to the tenants and you say, we'll give you a new kitchen, new bathroom, new roof, and so on the basis that you transfer the landlord over to a housing association. So the SDLP were the ones who were advocating this policy in the privatisation policy in the first place. I've talked to a number of Sinn Féin MLAs over the years about why they have never taken the community's portfolio. Now they have now. So it's one of the things you can say, okay, well, you know, the jury's out on them, right? They're in there now with that ministry. I'm not very confident that they're going to do anything particularly unless they're forced to. The new housing bill that they've just put through, I think, was an opportunity to do something radical and different with housing associations, to keep housing associations on the public books, because they'd been reclassified and they could be kept on the public books and could be integrated into the housing executive, or they could choose to go back out into the private sector without getting any public funding. Instead, they followed exactly down the same line that Westminster went down for the English housing policy and said, we'll put you back in the private sector and we're still going to give you loads of public funding. So the initial omens aren't great on that. And just in terms of I think that, look, at some point we need to discuss actually about public housing and local authorities. I don't think we're probably at that stage at the moment for all the historic reasons that we've talked about. I think the housing executive is the vehicle for this, and that means I think we should be arguing for building up those direct labour organisations in the housing executive, right, through the structures that they have, right, at local levels, and increasing the presence on estates. Having housing executive offices and caretakers and so on actually much more prominent on the estates. And there are ways that we can think about maybe devolving some responsibility and some funding potentially onto local estates, if there are committees there that are reflecting and democratically constituted, to do certain repairs or maintenance. But those are, I think, areas for discussion more than the key thing has to be housing executive allowed to build and borrow again.
Right, brilliant. Thank you, Stuart. I think we're going to have to wrap it up there. But thanks again for speaking at the lecture, and hopefully next year we'll see you all again under some better circumstances. Thank you all very much for coming.
Thanks, Stuart.
Cheers. Thanks all. Thanks for the invite.